You're watching City Channel 4, your window to our community.
Good evening, everybody. What a great crowd. Thank you for coming out tonight. We're all in for a great treat. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker tonight. My name is Jeff Fruin. I'm the city manager here in Iowa City. And it's a pleasure to have with us a world-renowned city planner and urban designer who has authored and co-authored 3 of the most influential books in city planning over the last 20 years. His latest book, Walkable Cities, is a must-read, and thanks to our friends at Prairie Lights, is available for you this evening if you wish. I really encourage everybody to pick this up. Great, easy read that will really transform your views on city planning. Through his work leading the National Mayor's Institute on City Design and the Governor's Institute on Community Design, and through his work with his consulting firm, Speck and Associates, Jeff has helped countless cities develop strategies to strengthen their urban core. Jeff is not just here to present to you tonight. He has been busy since landing in Cedar Rapids this morning. He was able to tour Iowa City's downtown and riverfront crossings with some of our staff and has already provided great value to us with some of his observations. Tomorrow he'll be again meeting with city staff and with some of the students and faculty at the University of Iowa School of Urban and Regional Planning. So it's a pleasure to have Jeff here with us, and I look forward to him presenting to you and for you to be able to ask questions of him at the end. So without further ado, Jeff Speck, everybody.
Thanks, Jeff. Nobody leaves. Well, actually, that's permanent. I'll just ignore. Thank you, Jeff. I think I have my own mic, so I'll put this down. Can you all hear me okay? In the back? It's been a fun day. I've been here a number of times before, but never officially. I've snuck through. I made the wise choice of marrying a woman from Davenport, Iowa, and go Quad Cities. And they're all crazy Iowa fans, as you might imagine. None of them have gone to the University of Iowa. They just the game of the football. Hello, hello. Is that better? Test. And my 8-year-old has decided he's going to the University of Iowa. We'll see. We'll see. But I've also done a fair amount of work with, actually a little bit of work, but I made many visits to Des Moines and known Mayor County there for many years. And so that Des Moines Quad Cities trek has brought us through here, and we'd always try and stop for lunch or just to walk around. I think, don't tell them I said this in Des Moines or in Davenport, but what everyone says is that this is the nicest city in Iowa. And I think what they mean by that, I would say it's the most walkable city with the most street life and the most, there's the most there, I think, in terms of a walkable downtown. I say that as I head next week to Davenport, to Des Moines, where I'm on the team that is redesigning all the downtown streets. We're doing a downtown transportation master plan after so many years of trying, and I'll say here and not there, it really took the private sector to demand it for that plan to finally happen. There was a limited commitment, I think, at the strictly governmental level. And they had to hear from the private sector, who demanded it and is largely funding it, to say, okay, we're finally going to do this. We're going to look at all our downtown streets and try and make the city more walkable and more livable. Thank you, Mayor Throckmorton, for being here. I know there's some other city councilors here. I met with some earlier today, where I spoke to a number of different communities, not just Iowa City. Today is just Iowa City, and I can focus on tonight, I can focus on the downtown and other parts of your city proper and not worry so much about the regional picture, but I will be talking about that a bit. I've also been told I don't have to rush, which means you get the big show. But I talk fast and I go fast. I promise to entertain, and that means start away. I give talks the Walkable City, which is the title need it, and on how to do it. The Why We Need It talk is a talk that was a real story of my evolution as a planner, or really we new urbanists as planners arguing for many years, really for decades, and my mentors before me, for the Walkable City by many different names, but always arguing for the same thing and finding, using our planning vocabulary and our design skills, finding a certain amount of uptake and not all that much uptake. So, we argued about why walkable cities were aesthetically better and more pleasurable. There was less social isolation and all the things that planners talk about. And that had some impact. But the big discovery as a planner for me, I talk about in the first part of the book, which is called Why Walkability, is discovering these three other fields that people listen to much more than they listen to planners, who each kind of singing from their own hymnal was singing for the walkable city, and none of us were really communicating with each other. And my argument for the walkable city now is no longer the planner's argument, it's the economist's argument, the environmentalist argument, and the epidemiologist's argument. So very quickly, I just want to mention what those are. Kind of has a good side and a bad side. Bad side, in 2010, we basically doubled the number of roads in America. And in 1970, we spent 1/10 of our income on transportation. By 2010, we spent 20% of our income on transportation. So what we've learned now, what the economists are telling us, is that by making driving mandatory, by burdening most Americans, rich and poor, in most places with mandatory automobile use, we've actually, what we've bought for ourselves with this incredibly expensive highway system and road system, what we've bought for ourselves is actually having to pay more than we ever did before to get around. Working Americans, as so defined by the federal government, are paying as much for transportation now, for the first time ever, as much for transportation as they do for housing. And poor Americans, similarly defined, are paying 40% roughly of their income on transportation because we burden them with this system. So that's the bad side. It's also a discussion about externalities and what the real cost to society is. And you have to acknowledge as a planner that mobility equates to wealth. And the more mobile your society is, not figuratively, but literally, the more mobile your society is, the more wealth is generated. But the question is, what cost is that wealth being provided at? And people are always talking, for example, about transit subsidy and highway investment. And I say, well, maybe we should switch the terms around. Because what happens is for every dollar you spend riding the bus, society does subsidize you about $1.50. But if you look at the externalities, like road construction, road repair, ambulances, and other costs associated with driving, for every dollar you spend driving, society pays about $9.20. And this chart was made when gas was 50% more expensive than it is now. So I think it's probably even greater. Then, of course, conveniently included in this discussion, for every dollar you spend biking, society pays 8 cents. I guess that's for your bike path. And for every dollar you spend walking, I don't know how you spend money walking, shoes maybe, society pays 1 cent. I'm guessing this is an estimate, but the point is there are much greater costs to society for every dollar that every dollar that you spend driving. And so state government, city government, federal government, if it's interested in seeing the most mobility, the most wealth at the lowest cost, should be investing in alternative modes of transportation. There's a lot more to say about that, but the positive story regarding walkability is, as you've probably all been noticing, almost to a fault, people want to be in walkable places now and they're paying more to be in them. and our city centers, one after the other, even as cities lose population, our city centers are all gaining population. And of course, in the cities that are already pretty healthy, you have this tremendous problem of gentrification. In the typical American cities where I work, the gentrification isn't yet a problem, it's a fear. But the point is, there's never been a better time for walkability in city centers because people want to be there. And if you're an investor or a real estate developer, you're going back to walkable places to make your money. So that's a good sign. The environmentalist discussion is a fascinating one because the environmentalist movement has historically in this country been an anti-city movement. You know, back to Jefferson, who said cities are pestilential to the health, to the morals, to the liberties of man. If we continue to pile upon ourselves in cities as they do in Europe, we shall become as corrupt as they are in Europe and take to eating one another as they do there. But really, the whole environmentalist movement in the US was always anti-city, and that was particularly the case. This is Superstorm Sandy in New York City, but that was particularly the case. This movement became about climate change and became about carbon footprint, and so we measured carbon per square mile. This is Chicago. When you measure, go Cubs, when you measure carbon per square mile, every American city looks like this. Red hot at the center, kind of orange at the edges in the suburbs, and then blue and pristine out in the exurban areas. And this further reinforced the idea that suburban living and country living was somehow better for the environment, until a very smart economist said, what if we measure carbon not per square mile, but per household? Because there are only so many of us in the country at any given time. We can choose to live where we have the lighter footprint. If you measure per household, this is what happens. The whole thing just flips. And all of a sudden, the new message, which, by the way, has been completely embraced by the environmentalists who have turned on a dime, is if you love nature, stay the hell away from it. You know, live in a city, the denser the better. And if you want to reduce your carbon footprint, which for most of us is driving, principally, then you should live in a walkable urban place. Finally, and then there's this. This was in the DC Metro a few years ago, but this is an ad from Chevron. This is like, you know, who has the meats? We have the meats. But Arby's. It's like Arby's having an ad saying, I will eat salad only, right? Because they're saying, don't buy our product. But the point is, you know, if I want to have a lighter carbon footprint, I'm going to try to drive less. But how can this woman leave the car at home when this is where she lives? And that's the issue, is that we don't have the choice anymore if we live in suburbs to have a lighter footprint. And then finally, the epidemiologist, and I like to say that the best day to be a planner in America was August 7th, 2004, when a book came out called Urban Sprawl and Public Health. And it was written by these three epidemiologists, and they basically said, look, we've been talking about the American, you know, weight crisis and the weight-related health crisis and skyrocketing diabetes, and the fact we have the first generation of Americans who are expected to live shorter lives than their parents. And all we've been talking about is diet. But it's calories in and calories out, and actually it's the disappearance of the useful walk that is directly responsible for the morbidity of our society. So, you know, the fact that it's normal to drive to the parking lot, to take the escalator to the gym, to get on the treadmill, to get your exercise. You know, this is why fully 1/3 of children born after 2000 are expected to become diabetic by the CDC. It's preposterous. But these doctors were saying for the first time that it was an urban design error and there's an urban design solution, which of course is to make our cities, suburbs, places more walkable, or to get people to move, one way or the other. And then, of course, car crashes. This man being interviewed after an accident, like right after. But it's something we take for granted. It's a huge, you know, it's the single greatest killer of healthy Americans. And look at different countries per 100,000 population. The US is just so much worse than all of the richer countries. And most of it is because this is it shifts slightly when you do it per 100 million vehicle miles traveled. But the point is, most of it's because we're driving more, but a lot of it's because we're driving on faster, more dangerous streets. And so we lose a ton of people every year, and we injure permanently a lot of people in car crashes. But then what's amazing is you look city by city at the walkable versus the left. If you are in New York, you have a 3.9 per 100,000 chance of dying this year in a car crash. In San Francisco, it's almost the same. In Dallas, it's 9.8. In Orlando, it's 19.4. It's not just all the old people driving. It's the number of your miles that you're driving on highways and the number of miles you have to. And so actually, you can have a tremendous impact on the health of our nation by putting more people in places, or allowing people to live affordably in places where they don't have to drive so much. You people in the back, you're welcome to stay there. We have some seats right in front. I spit only a little when I speak. So that's the very short version of the why. There's a lot more compelling information, and I encourage you to watch my TED Talk, which is just my name, which has a K at the end. You'll find it at TED.com, where I go through that in about 16 minutes. But if you want a longer version, it's in the book. So let's get into the meat of the matter, which is you're already convinced that you want a more walkable community. So how are we going to do it? And we begin with the presumption, as I've said, that walkable places are thriving places, and we ask, if that's the case, how do we get more people to walk? And that leads to what I call, only slightly tongue-in-cheek, my general theory of walkability. And what this theory does, which is the organizational structure of the book and the organizational structure of my talk today, is it says, if we're going to get people to walk in America, in which driving is so cheap and so easy, and you don't pay the full cost of driving by a long shot, as we've seen. You pay a fraction of the real cost to society. If you own a large American sedan, 4/5 of the cost of having the car is owning it, and only 1/5 is driving it. So the fixed costs are huge, the variable costs are limited, and so every mile you drive costs less than the mile before. And the smart thing to do is to drive it all the time. And it's sitting there in the driveway between you and everything. So there's all these incentives to driving. How do we get people to walk or bike? And the answer is that the walk or the bike has to be as good as the drive, period. Now, we could be more subtle and more sophisticated, but I've decided that there are 4 things that the walk has to do. It has to be useful, it has to be safe, it has to be comfortable, and it has to be interesting. And if it can do all 4 of those things at once, then it's as good or better than the drive, and we can get more people to walk. So let's do the first category, the reason to walk, which is a story I learned from my mentors. This is Duany and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, who founded among others, few others, the new urbanism movement, and my mentors. And Andres used to give a talk which he called the story of planning. And the story of planning goes like this. Back in the 19th century, people were choking on the soot from the dark satanic mills, and the planners, who were not yet called planners, said, hey, let's separate the housing from the mills so that people can live longer. And they did it, and lifespans increased immediately and dramatically, and the planners were hailed as heroes, and they've been trying to repeat that victory ever since. So you have the onset of what's called Euclidean zoning, the separation of the landscape into large areas of single use, where retail is separated from office, is separated from medical office, from high density and lower density housing, and who knows what this is. But that, we now know when you go to planning school, you learn that this is wrong. Yet most places where I arrive to do a plan, there already is a plan on the land, and it looks like this. It has to be undone so you can do the right thing. But of course, when uses are big and far apart, it is not a walkable outcome for reasons I don't have to explain. Now, we're in a highfalutin university crowd here, so I can do my art history joke. I was an art history major, which they say isn't very valuable, but I can say, as a planner, you don't want a Rothko, you want a Syrah. Syrah was the pointillist, right? The most walkable, most livable places in America, and the highest mode share of walking is in Manhattan, which, Manhattan isn't that lovely to walk around. A lot of it's gritty and gray and unpleasant. But the fact is you have this incredible high density of different uses in this confetti-like configuration where even this, see this red color here? That's mixed use vertically, and it's everywhere, or it's in certain key places. So that's the first step. If you're going to zone by use, then zone in small increments and mix it all up. But that makes me need to give you the fundamental new urbanist argument, which I give everywhere I go, and it's the discussion that got me in this business. I thought I would be an architect. I was very much looking forward to designing the bathrooms of the wealthy for my career. But then I heard Andres Duany talk, and he gave this story called the story Towns versus Sprawl. And he told us there are only two tested ways to build communities in the world. Now, there's 100 ways to make a town, but there's only two things we've done by the thousands. And one is the traditional neighborhood, and the other is suburban sprawl. The traditional neighborhood, you're looking at Newburyport, Massachusetts, near where I live now. It's defined, the traditional neighborhood, as being compact, diverse, and walkable. You're looking actually at several neighborhoods of Newburyport. If you go around the world, throughout different cultures, you find typically a 5-minute walk from edge to center is the size of a neighborhood. It's about a half mile across. It's diverse in that there are places to live, big houses and small, places to work, places to worship, places to recreate, places to shop. Most of your daily needs, not all of them, are within walking distance. And therefore, you don't need to get around a different way. And then finally, there's lots of streets, as I will demonstrate. Because there's so many streets, no one street needs to be very big. Now, the opposite of compact, diverse, and walkable is sprawl by definition. Sprawl because it sprawls. Not diverse. Whole square miles hold just one use, sometimes just one house over and over again, right? And it's not walkable, and this is important. There's lots of streets, but so few of them get you anywhere, right? Cul-de-sacs and loops. Those few that do they have to handle all of the through traffic. And so they're designed and oversized around the peak condition, and they become noxious. We call them vehicle sewers. And you can see the houses turn their backs to them. There's not a single address on these roads. And of course, you don't let your kid out. So your kid is perfectly happy on their big wheel, and the cul-de-sac kid happy until about age 7. And then they want to have more freedom, and they can't have more freedom because you wouldn't let them on the arterial roads. So it's, everyone wants their kid to grow up in a cul-de-sac, but not if you understand the larger system where they're entrapped. So it's fun to break sprawl down into its constituent parts, the places where you only live, where you only work, where you only shop. Schools supersized, often for the convenience of the janitor or the lawn mowing crew, or for the simplicity of the budget. This is a South Florida school. Also, it's what we call pioneering sprawl. You get to the edge of the city, and there's some big piece of land available, so that's where the school goes, and now all the roads are opened up for everyone to sprawl, and yes, I know. And the size of the parking lot compared to the size of the school is all you need to know about this school, which is no child has ever walked to this school, no child will ever walk to the school. The seniors and the juniors are driving the freshmen and the sophomores, and we have the death rates to prove it. But when you consolidate, you separate. The bigger your school is, the further away your school is. And when I was starting at DPZ in the 90s, I was reading articles about Iowa, famous for its schools, and the articles were saying it's because of the small size. I don't know if that's still the belief. But I do understand, I had this conversation with some of your leaders this afternoon, that I worry, I don't know anything about how it's been done here, but I worry about the choice. I worry that the choice to consolidate schools is often made without calculating in the cost in health and academic performance for kids who aren't walking to school anymore. And then also just frankly, simply the cost of busing. Because sometimes it's an apples to apples comparison and you forget that you have to have twice as much busing when the school is further away. So anyway, it's an issue, but certainly from a walkability perspective, not the only one that matters. From a walkability perspective, smaller schools and neighborhood schools are much superior. Playing fields also have been supersized, consolidated. Weston, also in South Florida, is very proud of its 8 soccer fields and 8 baseball diamonds. But this is why we have the soccer mom in America. When I was young, I walked to I had one baseball field and one soccer field and a couple tennis courts, but they were in walking distance because it was all neighborhood by neighborhood. And here, this child, never mind the moat with alligators actually in it and the long ride, but this kid has to be driven a mile to get to this field because the mom or dad won't let them on this traffic sewer, right? So it's not a good model for walking or for health. So when you break the landscape into these single-use zones that are large and reconnect those zones only with automotive transportation, then the part the planners forgot to count, when Frank Lloyd Wright envisioned Broadacre City, he had people in little personalized helicopters, that's another story. But they just didn't realize that the American, which was created for commerce and for vacation travel, was going to become a commuter way to get to and from work and everything else. So I always tell people, for some this is the American dream, although the number of people who say they want to live in a house where they can't walk to stores and restaurants and other things is now about 10%. They used to ask the question wrong, right? But now that they've asked the question properly, and they said, do you want to have access from your home to these other things? Only 10% want this. But this is the vision for many of the American dream. Just understand it's a two-part deal. And you can't have this without that. Often to absurd extremes. And what we pay so that you never have to wait. What's the rule here? Well, it's level of service F if you have to wait more than one signal cycle to get through this intersection. Which of course is an impossibility because if you have to sit here for 2 minutes, you want to kill yourself. So this is outside of Boston. Where's the intersection? I was dodging the question because I remembered it as Framingham, and then I learned Framingham was wrong. I forget where it is. Like it's somewhere close to Boston, like Revere or someplace like that. And apparently, this was done in order to save a IHOP or something. Historic structure. So anyway, we gold plate the horizontal infrastructure, and we rob our schools and our churches and other public buildings of investment because this is where our national wealth has gone. Of course, the experience of driving is never any fun. This is not Photoshop. This is a real place. I could explain it, but I don't have time. And it's stressful on families. A recent study showed that the longer your commute, the more likely you are to be divorced, which seems kind of obvious, but we don't think about it very much. And one thing the doctors, the epidemiologists talked about in urban sprawl and public health was all the social costs of our difficult commuting lifestyles. So, being a driver is a drag, and being a pedestrian can be worse. So these are the two models then. And we're done talking about the rest of my talk's really going to be about the places you have. But as you make new places and you're making them, you have a choice between these two models. It's very simple to distinguish them. One has big things that are far apart. One has small things that are integrated. One has a dendritic, what's called a dendritic system, a branching system of collector roads and local dead ends, and the other has that beautiful network that looks a lot like, where is it? I've been to an Iowa town that's exactly like that. So anyway, you need to recognize these two models and know which one you're getting as you move forward. And I should say, the only traditional neighborhood development that I've seen, and obviously it's flawed, obviously it's a compromise, but it's darn good, is the Peninsula. The only one I've seen in Iowa is the Peninsula, which is here in Cedar Rapids. In Iowa City, excuse me. I asked the mayor, have you seen any others in Iowa? And he said, yeah, there's one that was botched that I saw. I think it was north of Des Moines. I said, oh, in Ames? And he goes, yeah. I go, oh, yeah, I designed that. And I forgot about it. But I designed it in '93 when no one was ready for it. And it's a long story, but it was botched, and it's better than it would have been and worse than it should have been. So, looking at Iowa City, not Cedar Rapids, and your downtown, and your other existing places, particularly your old main streets and a lot of great towns, frankly, around Iowa. There's dozens of them, this one being the one with the biggest concentration of walkability. The question you ask in terms of the useful walk is what is missing or underrepresented in the city center? And the answer in most places is housing. Midtown Atlanta has a 3-to-1 jobs to housing balance. Boise, Idaho has a 43-to-1 jobs to housing balance. I don't know what yours is here. The fact that you've got the university, that means a lot of jobs, and it means a lot of students. I think one of the reasons why your downtown feels so vital is that your jobs housing balance isn't that far off. But there's no doubt that it's more jobs than housing, and anything you can do to bring more housing into your downtown is going to make it more walkable. When the housing increases and there's more nighttime activity to match the daytime activity, then all these other uses kick in. And Jane Jacobs talked about this. She said, why, back in the 60s, why is there no great restaurant on Wall Street? Why is there no great gym on Wall Street? Because a great restaurant, truly great gym needs lunchtime and nighttime clientele. And that's what happens when you get a more 24/7 downtown. So, oh my gosh, this is so big and modern and I'm scared. But this is the sort of thing, and this is coming. This is called what? The edge? The rise. I'm sure there's a lot of people who feel that this is somehow, although you do have some serious tall buildings already, that this is somehow not of Iowa City. But I'm telling you, it will make the downtown much more lively and much more walkable, and this sort of thing is supportive of being a more walkable place. The other part of the equation in the useful category, of course, is transit. If you can't connect your walkable areas together, your principal destinations and sources of people walking, with transit, then people will still buy cars. And then the city keeps growing around driving. You've got a good local transit system and an amazing college transit system open to the public that happens to photograph beautifully. And, oh my gosh, look at that photo. That's because these architects got it in a magazine. But I heard there were 7 million rides last year on your local transit, which is astounding. And the only thing I can say is, just make sure your two systems are well coordinated, the city and the school, or the region and the university, and know that supporting transit is, of course, supporting walkability. Now, the big category. I'm going to spend most of my time on this category. The last two categories are very quick, so join me as we consider what makes a walk safe. And the principal consideration, or I should say all the issues I'm going to raise, point back to this diagram, which basically says what we know. You're 8 times as likely to be killed by a car going 35 than you are by a car going 25. And so that's a real important cusp. And frankly, that's the cusp on which most people are driving in your downtown faster than or slower than, based on the cues they're receiving from the landscape. And that's a big difference between highway engineering, which for years dominated downtown traffic planning, and reality of places where people live, work, and play, which is that on highways, you set your speed based on the speed limit. Like if you're me, you set your cruise control to 9 miles an hour over the speed limit. That's how you determine your speed on the highway. But downtown, or in any place where there's people around, your speed is set actually by the speed which by your feeling of safety, security, and that you're not going to hit things. And so every aspect of the landscape or the urban realm needs to reinforce a safe speed, which is pretty much the posted speed, but of course most people speed above that. So the first thing that does that is block size. This is Portland, Oregon, famously walkable, famously 200-foot blocks. This is Salt Lake City, famously unwalkable, famously 600-foot blocks. These are the flags they give you to hold up when you cross the street in Salt Lake City. Because here they are, oh, and then this is the experience. Ian Lockwood is an engineer who draws these great cartoons. But this is what a small grid feels like. This is what a big grid feels like. You just don't really know how to climb it, right? But here they are side by side, and the main message here is that a 200-foot block city can be mostly a 2-lane city. The streets average 2 lanes here, because there's a lot of 1-lane one-ways actually, but the average width is 2 lanes. The average width in New York City is Probably also 2 lanes if you think about it, because of all those 1-lane cross streets, hundreds of them, right? And then Salt Lake City, you know, a 600-foot block city is a 6-lane city. So there's a general correlation there. Here's 24 California cities. As you double the block size, the number of fatal crashes not on highways almost quadruples. So smaller blocks are safer. Here's your downtown, quite healthy, quite a nice grid. It's about 300 feet, a little less, I think. And here's where I turn to you and say, you have good bones. So you can be a walkable place, a more walkable place, without much trouble. Here you are compared to the best, right? Portland's about the best. That still puts you on the small side of average. And then you have certain things, you know, maybe we shouldn't have consolidated that block, but it's done. But these pedestrian streets, they kind of count as streets. They certainly count as streets for pedestrians. And, you know, these rarely work. There are about 200 of them done in the US, about 150 of them failed. But the places they work are mostly university towns. You probably know some of the others like Madison and Burlington, Vermont, and Boulder. You know, I could name about 8 of them. But obviously there's something that a pro-walkability guy has to be in favor of. And I think they work very well here. And even though many of them have failed, we're starting to bring them back in lots of other places. And the key question is, can the shops survive without cars parking in front? And in many cases like this, they can. So the grain may be a little bit large for cars, but at least it's broken up for pedestrians. And then you have the west side. You know, here's again 200 feet. The blocks are much bigger, and hospitals are always to blame for this. And there's not much you can do about it. In fact, some streets have gone through the hospital to make it better with bridges and other things over, which is good, but then they were designed like this. And I'm not sure what the criteria were for the design of this 4-foot sidewalk that's interrupted every few feet, or the stripy kind of highway engineering look of that street, but clearly walkability wasn't a high priority. Well, we talked about the larger blocks on that side. So next up, and I've already implied it, after block size is the number of lanes in the street. And the more lanes in the street, obviously the more it looks like a highway, the faster cars go, and the further you have to cross. So fewer lanes is better. This, who recognizes Cedar Rapids? And Cedar Rapids was a place where I started working about maybe 7 or 8 years ago. And they acknowledged that they had kind of Salt Lake City streets with more of a Portland grid. So we know that 2 lanes can handle 10,000 cars per day. A 2-lane road without a turn lane can handle 10,000 cars per day. And this grid had like nothing more than 6,000 cars per day on any of the streets, except the state highway, which has to stay a state highway. So, you know, we said we can take 2 lanes out of almost all of these streets. We can also revert the one-ways, which are bad for shopping, bad for shops, bad for safety, bad for crime. The studies are in. I removed my one-way system. I removed my one-way segment from this talk because you only have a couple left and you're already reverting them. But it's most important in commercial areas where one-ways hurt businesses and have been demonstrated when you put the one-ways back to 2-way, the businesses do better, crime goes down, speeding goes down, injuries go down. But this was a half one-way system and mostly 4-lane, and it looked like this. And so I worked with the Public Works Department, and we restriped all the streets from this to that. Almost all 2-way, almost all 2-lane, which gave us a ton of extra space. So this was our parking before, where red is angle parking, and now it can become this, which really helps the merchants. And then this was the bike system before, which can become that. And they decided not to fund it, not out of a lack of enthusiasm, but they realized that they were going to be restriping their streets anyway as they improve them. So every year another street goes, and I think it's probably about half done now. I'm going to visit tomorrow and find out. But it'll be a much more walkable downtown. Now, here's a trick so I haven't said yet. My main frustration, I took a tour with the city planners and talked to people. My main frustration being here is that you're doing too well. And you don't need me. And I can tell you I'm not coming back because no one's going to ask. Because your city planning department is already and others. I mean, public works and engineering, everyone's already on the right page. If anything, perhaps I can light a fire under some of these things, help them to get this political support that they need to do it more quickly. But this is a trick that I thought I was going to introduce to poor Iowa City, the classic American road diet. Have you heard of this? But of course, you're already doing them. But the idea, which we've now done in dozens of places around the U.S., is to take a 4-lane road and turn it into a 3-lane road, which gets you something else. It gets you bike lanes or parking or both, usually one or the other, because you're only losing 1 lane. But it turns a street that's very dangerous into a street that's much safer. It's dangerous because the fast lane is also the turning lane. And this guy stops for you and you turn, and then this person hits you. And that's not good. So that doesn't happen when you have a shared center turn lane. So no one is supposed, so I say, read it carefully. I say don't rebuild your streets, just restripe them, because it's a lot cheaper. And that's what we're doing in Iowa City, by the way. In Cedar Rapids, with no construction. It's all paint on the road. So when you restripe like that, accidents drop precipitously. No surprise. But this is the surprise, which is this is 17 different road diets all around the U.S., before and after, no decrease in throughput of vehicles in the road. So the 3-laner handles as much traffic as the 4-laner. So that gives you a justification to not worry. Clinton Street, people are ready to revert it. There's no reason not to if you're worried about traffic. Hawkins Drive. So basically I zoomed around Google and I found a bunch of them. Hawkins Drive, I don't know if that one's under consideration. Definitely under consideration, but somewhat shaky in consideration is Gilbert, which I think is very ready. And not only, as I'll discuss, not only is it 4 lanes, but it's 4 wide lanes. So this is 45 feet from curb to curb. It should really be 40. So I took the liberty of redesigning it, but I think the city already has a design for this. But you can see, going from this, 4 11-plus foot lanes gets you this. If you 3-lane it, you've got, I won't call it buffered, but it's it's not protected, but it's a slightly buffered bike lane on each side. And when there's 3 lanes instead of 4, it's a much safer street to bike on. So there's no reason not to do this soon. Next is as I suggest, yay Gilbert. Next is the width, as I suggested, of the lanes themselves. Notice the donut marks. Andres Duany used to show this slide, and he'd say, the typical road, the typical subdivision in America is wide enough to allow you to experience the curvature of the earth, which is true, because the standards have changed. There's been this mission creep. This used to be a big enough street in the 1960s, now from the same height. Here's the subdivision from the 80s, 1960s, 1980s, and look what happened to the width of the street, because the standards have changed. There's been this ever-enlarging creep, such that my old neighborhood of South Beach in Miami, when this street wasn't draining properly and the curbs had to be rebuilt, this new standard kicks in, takes half our sidewalk and our street trees, even though it was working perfectly well before. So we have to be very careful about that, because a wider street is a faster street. Drivers know this. Drivers know intuitively a 10-foot lane is a 30-mile-an-hour lane, 12-foot lane is a 70-mile-an-hour lane. Here's the data of speeds. This is lane widths, and this is driver speeds. And you see how it gets faster as the lanes get wider. One study suggested that we lose 900 people per year because lanes are too wide, and we've been saying this now for decades, and many cities still have a 11-foot or a 12-foot standard. And so here's where I ask, we're a society that's shown itself able to correct its errors, and the next great public health crisis, I would argue, after smoking, is 12-foot lanes. Sounds a little inside baseball, but I really believe it. Citizens seem to understand this. They fight for narrower streets. Portland, always on the edge, has a skinny streets program in its city. And then finally, NACTO. So now this is the people in charge, the National Association of City Traffic Traffic officials is saying, this is a tweet, so they mean it. Lane widths, I think it was a 3 a.m. tweet. Lane widths of 10 feet are appropriate in urban areas and have a positive impact on a street's safety. So there's the standard, and that's the standard we should adopt, especially because one study showed in a variety of accidents that when it's 12 feet wide versus 10 feet wide, you have 10 times the severity of impacts in the collisions. So here's Clinton Street, and you can see there's two things wrong with this image. You can see it's too wide. This should be 8 feet for parking, 8, 10, 10, 8. And that makes 36, but look, it's 54. So there's a ton of room for other stuff in there. There's room for buffered bike lanes, protected bike lanes in that street. Here's Dubuque Street. Again, it should be 36 feet if by the standard. And the space between the cars should be 20 feet. It's 32 feet. Again, room for buffered bike lanes. So we can do that. My next segment is signals. Here's a story I only tell in Iowa, but Darren Nordahl was the director of planning at Davenport, where I did some work. And we were just so curious, why did all the intersections in Davenport have signals when there was like no traffic in Davenport? And he did the research. It turned out that the consultants who advised them on where to put their signals was also the company that sold them their signals. There you go. But I do believe we're over-signaled in this country, and that the new ideal intersection for pedestrians, better than a roundabout, which is still a vehicular environment, is the four-way stop, the all-way stop. Where there's some in your downtown, I know, I've been through them. You know your experience as a pedestrian is there's a lot of eye contact, everyone's looking at everyone else. The bicyclists, of course, just blow right through. It's great for everybody. Almost. But the study is very clear. It was done in Philadelphia. They had to remove signals because the warranting system changed, and most of the signals now no longer qualified to be signals anymore. And they removed 472 signals in Philadelphia and replaced them with four-way stops. They studied 199 of them. Crashes went down by a quarter. Severe injury crashes went down 63%. Severe pedestrian injury crashes went down 68%. So it's worth looking at your downtown signals, or really anywhere for that matter, but particularly when you take a multi-lane one-way and turn it into a two-way, all of a sudden you don't need the signal anymore. When you have more than one lane in any given direction, a stop sign gets confusing. Which one of us goes next? But when you have only one lane in each direction, you can go back to the stop signs. So this is funny. Traffic engineers in Philadelphia believe that the safety benefit stems from the elimination of the local habit of speeding up to beat the red, because that only happens in Philadelphia. So our plan for Cedar Rapids actually removes 11 of the 17 signals in the downtown. And they were about to spend $150,000 on each of them, fixing them up, so we're saving them money. So let's have some new stop signs. Then signals. Now here's where I get really personal, but you have some push-button signals in your downtown, you shouldn't have any. The signal should we were walking around today and we never got the walk sign at some corner because we didn't push the signal. You shouldn't have to ask for the light as a pedestrian. It's insulting, and it's just, walkable cities don't have push buttons. But there's another thing that most walkable cities have that you guys don't have, which is what's called the concurrent signalization, which means you don't have to wait for all the cars to take all their turns before you get to go. You have a lot of intersections in your downtown here where you just stand there, dopey, because you can't go this way and you can't go that way because all the cars are turning first. And in fact, Washington, D.C. doesn't do that. New York City doesn't do that. Portland doesn't do that. The cars have to wait for you to take the crosswalk and go, and they do. But there's one little trick called the LPI, the lead pedestrian indicator, which gives you the walking man 3 seconds before the cars get the green. And we've introduced those in Washington, and they're very effective. But I would argue that you need to change your signalization slightly in that way. Bikes, next category. A street with bikers in it is safer for everyone. Everyone, pedestrians too. The data is very clear. Every now and then a bike messenger will kill somebody, but the data that's the confusing anecdote that belies the greater experience, which is that a street network full of bikes is a street network that's safer for everybody, drivers too. So biking is the biggest planning revolution currently underway in only some American cities. This is Portland, Oregon, where they made the investment, $60 million over about 20 years, and they created a really good bike infrastructure. And I asked my friend Tom Brennan, who works for Nelson Nygaard, to send me some pictures of the Portland bike commute, and he sent me these. So was this bike to work day? He said, no, this is Tuesday in Portland. Because they made the investment. And the one thing we've learned, bicycle populations follow bicycle investment more than anything else. This is the new gold standard, Chicago. There are elsewhere also. The protected bike lane. This is a line of parked cars. They've been pulled off the curb. So now there's this door zone and then this protected way. It's a one-way street. It's a two-way cycle track. This guy's going the wrong way. And then they painted them green because everyone loved them so much. Even better, still going the wrong way. But you can see how it works. Here's the one in New York City. A 3-laner became a 2-laner. It's Prospect Park West, a huge lawsuit generator, not from accidents, but from angry neighbors who don't like bikes. And but it survived. The number of cyclists tripled, of course. Speeding went from almost all the drivers to 17%. Crashes went down 63%, injury crashes, but the car volume did not drop. And that's the surprising thing. We lost a lane. Why did car volume not drop? The reason, according to the studies, is that they were just basically speeding from red to red. And you know, once cars get faster than, say, 30 or 35 miles an hour, the spacing increases to such a degree the road actually carries fewer cars per hour. So that's one explanation for what happened. So this is just last week. The bike-hating NIMBY trolls grudgingly surrendered to reality. They gave up on their lawsuit and allowed this this to stay. But Jeanette Sadiq Khan, the traffic commissioner who built these, was in court for years over them. So look at the difference, right? That, you know, this used to be the gold standard. This looks like Washington, D.C., where I've done a lot of biking. But, you know, this is now the gold standard, and to get the women and children to bike, this is what you need. Otherwise, everyone's what they call the mammals. The middle-aged men in Lycra are your only cyclists. So, and then of course, this is in Iowa City. I found this on Google. The FedEx truck is, of course, in the biking lane, which is very dangerous as a cyclist, as you probably know. And this is my favorite. This is not in Cedar Rapids. Go figure. I love the internet. So you've got streets like Gilbert that we talked about that, look, it's got the Shiro in it. But the talk among planners is that a Shiro is not a bicycle facility. A Shiro is just wishful thinking. And if every lane is a bike lane like they believe, you know, the old vehicular cyclists used to say that bike lanes were separate but equal and not, separate but equal, and they looked down their nose on them, said we should mix with traffic. Bikes are vehicles just like cars. That was the dominant thought in Pasadena, where every lane is a bike lane, which is why there are no cyclists. And this is the only cyclist I met in Pasadena. So it's not a cult, as you might think. You see a lot of headlines like this. Tech companies, you know, millennials want a bike. They put it high on their list of why they move to places. And people who hire talent want people to bike, want to make biking good. So the mammal is not your, you know, don't picture this when you think of your cycle. A lot of places I go, this is who they think of when they think of the cyclist. Nowadays, it's much more this, or actually statistically, it's this. And if you care about equity in your cities, as cities have an obligation to do, then bike lanes is one of the most kind things you can offer to your citizens. So this is fascinating in Iowa, because this is summer temperature and this is winter temperature. And this line, which has nothing to do with it at all, is biking population, state by state by state. Iowa's kind of in the middle. Minneapolis, boom, right? Minneapolis is somewhere over here. But the cities, Minnesota. Cities, and basically what this spike is tracking as much as anything is investment. So I encourage you to do more. Parallel parking, often forgotten, sometimes removed for beautification. Parallel parking or angle parking, but parking at the curb is an essential barrier of steel that protects the sidewalk from moving vehicles. You're just not comfortable typically on sidewalks without that barrier. This is Happy Hour in Fort Lauderdale, famous for its happy hour. This is the side of the street you're allowed to park on. This is the side you're not allowed to park on. And then I walked over here and over there. This is happy hour on the parked side. And this is happy hour on the unparked side. because no one wants to sit next to these cars going 40 miles an hour. The other part of this picture is street trees, often forgotten in Iowa City, I've noticed. Street trees do so much. They absorb so much stormwater that instead of investing in God knows how many billions you're investing in stormwater because of all your flooding, if you invest in tree, okay, it's 20 years out, but a lot of stormwater investments are done 20 years out. There's nothing you could do better than to have what I call what do I call it? A complete canopy campaign. Complete canopy campaign. Every street lined by trees, and you've solved your stormwater. You're also collecting ozone, you're collecting CO2, you're improving the revenues to retailers, you're improving property value in a way that flows back to the city coffers. There's no better investment. But also what we've learned on this segment, the safety segment, is that street trees cause cars to drive more slowly. On a certain stretch of road, they measure the segments that have trees and no trees, and they found that cars drive more within the speed limit when there's this friction, right, when the street trees are next to the street. So the trees slow the cars down, sometimes dramatically. But better a tree than a pedestrian. And this is what a street feels like without, I didn't draw this, but it's what a street feels like when you don't have cars or trees protecting the curb. Kind of like that. Or the poorly named Sycamore Street, which is a new street that you've recently built, and I understand it's being restriped. So see, you guys, I try and catch you, and you're on top of your game, and you're fixing it already, but since I didn't know that, allow me to elaborate, that the small lane is 13 feet wide. The 3 lanes together are 43 feet wide for 3 lanes. So tons of extra room in that road for restriping, but I haven't designed a restriping plan. I've designed a what have you built it right plan. And the what have you built it right plan says take this street and take 13 feet out of it and just have 3 lanes of 30, and then you've got enough, because it's very expensive, much more expensive to build road than it is to build bike path, which is lighter on the land. And then, of course, you take that extra money you save and you plant trees. So instead of this, you could have had that. And then if you look at it actually, ignoring the pioneering school sprawl that's happening down here, this street will never, look at these densities, will never have more than 6,000, 7,000 cars per day on it. So why it's sized for 3 lanes, I have no idea. But it could actually be a 20-foot piece of pavement with some amazing bike lanes separated from it. So this is my red alert where I say something's wrong with your codes that you're building stuff like this, and you need to correct it before you build it, not after. Then crosswalks are a fun, when you're a planner, you watch the interwebs and you see what shows up. And the last year, there's been all these neat crosswalks, and there's been some fighting in the US about what's legal and what's not legal, but you have to accept that these Mexican and elsewhere crosswalks are very effective in getting drivers' attention, and they've been shown not to cause any accidents as they slow cars down. This one's in India. This is a trompe-l'oeil, but it's very effective at slowing cars down. These women built. And then, hooray, we found one. This is in Pittsburgh. So here's an American example. But there's no reason why you shouldn't be inviting your artist and other people to, see, that's the bike, and these are the walkers. But there's no reason why we can't be more creative with crosswalks. So here's my second, maybe I caught you at something, intervention, which is this riverfront crossing park concept plan, which you've probably seen. It's south of the city. First of all, I do have to say, I don't know what is happening here. Because, as a city planner, you have a certain obligation to study success and failure and base future plans on past successes. I have never seen a street like this with 3 concrete medians, no trees, curving around a corner. So I would just ask you to reconsider that, because it doesn't seem to bear a relationship to anything good. But then, I think this is just the firm that was hired to do this beautiful streetscape, and it's done quite well. I'm not criticizing it. Just somehow forgot about crosswalks. And I think it wasn't part of their job. But the crosswalks and the sidewalks really need to be designed as an integrated package if they're going to work. So I would say, red alert, number 2, there's no crosswalks in this scheme. And then also, look over here. I think I zoom in. There's no street trees either. These trees are in the lawn beyond where they don't belong, and probably they're imagined on private property. The street trees belong along the street. so they can protect the people walking from the cars. So that's my red alert number 2. Like, where are your street trees in your standards that they're not in this? And where are the crosswalks? And this is a very, I gotta say again, a very skillful design. It just needs to have the crosswalks in it. Okay, we're done with the big categories. Now we're gonna, very quickly, the 2 last fun categories you don't wanna miss. The comfortable walk and the interesting walk. The comfortable walk is a little bit counterintuitive because we all like to climb mountains and get broad views, but we also like to feel enclosed. And the evolutionary biologists tell us that all animals, humans among them, are simultaneously seeking prospect and refuge. You want to be able to see your predators before they get you, and you want to feel that your flanks are covered from attack. And if your flanks don't feel covered from attack, then actually you don't feel comfortable and you flee the space. So this is an amazing, we spend our vacation dollars going to places like this with prospect and refuge. This is Split, or Spoleto in Croatia. It looks like Venice. But, a plaza is only as good as its walls. And this ratio of height to width is something we new urbanists have been talking about for some time. Taller is generally good. 1-to-1 is the Renaissance ideal. Beyond 6-to-1, particularly if you don't have trees, beyond 6-to-1, you don't really feel enclosed anymore. And so a space isn't as successful at attracting pedestrians. So, 1-to-6 in Salzburg is a dream, even in a quite northern climate. 1-to-6 can be a dream. Of course, the opposite of Salzburg is Houston. And I'm being cruel because this area has largely filled in. Houston has come a long way, and I'm working in Houston. And if they knew I was showing this, they'd be very upset with me. But the point of this slide is that the surface parking lot, the exposed surface parking lot on your flank, is the principal villain in this conversation. And when you have a street like South Capitol with a big old parking lot on one side, that's a real disincentive for people to keep walking because the space bleeds. You lose that sense of enclosure. And then finally, the interesting walk. Well, we talked about the 1-to-1 ratio as one ideal. This is a 1-to-1 ratio. This is the street in Grand Rapids, a very walkable downtown, but where no one wants to walk between the 2 best hotels because, when one side of the street is an exposed parking deck and the other side is a hotel conference facility that was apparently designed in admiration for that parking deck, it's just boring, right? It's boring. And so we need vertical articulation. We need to hide our parking decks. Architects sometimes get it wrong, And we learned in Charleston from Mayor Riley, after 40 years, mayor for 40 years, that it only takes 20 feet of building to hide 200 feet of garage, just that thin sleeve of building. This is the one I know in South Beach I call it the Chia Pet garage, but the same effect. And then, don't feel bad. We all have these. The uncles we keep hidden under the stairs. But on Burlington Street and on Clinton Street and this beauty. And then we're getting better. So here's one. First of all, it's a pretty cool building, although it looks like a stadium, strangely. I thought they played football here and not west. Offices, not stores. Stores would be better. Still nice. An architect was involved. You're getting kind of partway there. And then there's this, which you probably are aware of, south of the downtown, but there's a new city parking lot going up that they saved the 20 feet, and they're building this. It's under construction now. So congratulations, you've turned this corner, literally and figuratively, and you're on the right track there. The job is well done. And then finally, blank walls. I used to work at the National Endowment for the Arts. I gave out a lot of grants to support public art, which for so many years was just plop art, the sculpture that lands on the plaza that you scratch your head at. But I think more and more public programs we're seeing, I have to say I'm not seeing it as much here. The last 3 cities I visited had a lot more murals going on than I'm seeing here. I know there's a lot of art students here, a lot of talent here. When you've got a blank wall that's that interrupting boredom between walkable and walkable, that's the place to put your public art budget. You can do. This is the American version. Here's the European version. But It's important that you keep it clean, take care of it. Yeah. Or this. But, whenever you've got a blank wall, it's a great place for just a little intervention that connects good to good so that you keep walking. And by the way, the best use of your money is connecting walkable areas to other walkable areas that they're close to, but there's something just bad in the way, like a Jiffy Lube or whatever. That's where the best investments can go. So I wanted to end with one thing that I didn't show the city officials earlier, but I'm an urban designer, and it's always important to remember that and offer things. But when you look at the downtown, and I know there's plans for this property, I haven't seen them, maybe it's exactly what I'm going to show you, but you don't feel the connection enough to the river, as you never do. Every riverside American downtown thinks that they're unique in how poorly they connect to their river. But actually, that's the standard American condition. If you want to see how to do it great, go to Chicago and see what they're doing right now in expanding the river's edge. But rivers were historically where the energy came from and where you dumped and the ships came in with goods and where you dumped your pollution. So it's taken a long time to turn around and embrace our riverfronts again. But this is a very powerful access, right through the heart of the campus. And this is a place to access the river and do something fun. And so what I'm suggesting is simply buildings embracing a public space that extends out and over the water in a, obviously floodable way. But that this is a chance to do what's missing in a lot of places, which is to energize the river's edge with an extension of your public space, of your streets, designed in PowerPoint. I discovered my shapes today, in fact. So that's it. That's the whole list. You really need to do all four of these things, we believe, in order to get people to walk. So you need to find those places where that's possible. Of this list, the reason to walk, the comfortable walk, and the interesting walk are principally a function of what's lining the street. That takes longer time, and the city can't really control it in the short term. It can control it in the longer term through financing, tax increment financing, through codes. It does control it, but that's a longer term investment, which is why so much of my work these days and the work I talk to your planners about was in the safe walk category and the chance to just restripe your streets to make them much more friendly and safe. And with this, I discovered this is just last month in the New Yorker, but I read this and I said, this is why I do what I do. First, cities are their streets. Streets are not just a city's veins, but its neurology, its accumulated intelligence. And so you can study architecture like I did and urban planning and find yourself focusing on yellow paint because, in fact, that's where we live our lives, and that's the part of the city that most of us experience on a daily basis. So I hope you'll read the book. It's for sale out back. I'll be sitting there signing them. And these are the other two books, if you're a real junkie, Suburban Nation and Smart Growth Manual, which I wrote with Andres and Liz. And then finally, I don't have the date yet. This is last year. But if some of you want to have 2 full days of this excitement, I teach a course at Harvard every summer. And if you get in touch with me, I will make sure that you're invited. It's expensive because it's Harvard. But they give you a piece of paper after 2 days that looks like you went to Harvard. So it's actually a good deal. And because I'm on Twitter, my self-worth is a function of my number of followers, so please do follow me. Jeff Speck, AICP. Jeff Speck, AICP. So I will take a couple questions, but first I will thank you for your kind attention.
You can.
And I'll use this. Hold on. Is this one just dead off? I'll use the podium. So I won't take too many questions. I don't want you to not buy a book.
I appreciate walkability, but there's those among us that cannot walk. And you have left a whole group of people out in a lot of your plans. For instance, where you have the cars as a buffer zone, I get out on the right side of a car. I get hit by a bike.
And sir, I saw your wheelchair as I came in, and I thought, do I bring up my part about walkability and rollability? And I said, no, I'm just going to give my normal talk. But the fact is that the walkable city is the rollable city. And there's a woman I work with at DPZ who is in a wheelchair, and she calls when she's moving around, she calls it walking, which I thought was really interesting. But the bike lane handicap parking condition is obviously one that varies from design to design. When there's a conflict between the exiting person in the wheelchair and the bike lane, it's not a handicap spot. And you better believe that the Walkable City has the full ADA regimen of proper ratios between accessible spots and standard spots. But I do feel like the work that I and my colleagues do is ultimately in support of everyone who's walking and biking and rolling through the city. But I do very much appreciate your question.
I just wonder about the, if you make the city more dense, you will have, and you want to reduce the streets, that means you will have a problem with fire safety. So the road, they design it to sustain or to protect such situation.
Thank you so much for that question. Next? No. We spend a lot of time negotiating with, which is a nice way of saying fighting, fire chiefs. We talk about it a lot in Suburban Nation. Clearly, the fire truck has to get through. What I neglected to tell you because of time limitations is that the principal reason why there's been that mission creep I described in residential neighborhoods, not the 10 to 12 foot creep, but the residential streets that get widened and widened, particularly in subdivisions, has been because of fire requirements. The Universal Fire Code often calls for a 20-foot clear, which was determined based on cul-de-sac suburbia, where there's only one path to every destination. So you have to be able to, in a cul-de-sac, park a truck, put the stabilizers down, and get another truck past it. And that 20 feet has invaded the entire discussion on street design. So now, even if you have a networked system, you have to buck the rules to get streets that are narrower than the 20-foot clear. I've found, though, that once we explain to the fire chiefs the alternate paths to the fire, and then in certain cases, do certain things that they ask us to do. For example, remove a certain area of parked cars at mid-block, so there's a staging area for a truck to park, that we've been able to reintroduce narrow streets again. But the argument that I've had the least traction with, which is the one that, least traction with fire chiefs, is the one that regular people, if I can say that, seem to understand intuitively, which is that whenever the study is done, one study was done particularly in Colorado that compares the loss of life on wider streets versus narrower streets to the loss of life from slow fire service on the narrower streets, and finds that the loss of life due to slow fire truck service is statistically insignificant compared to the loss of life that comes from cars speeding and hitting people. So we always say to fire chiefs, without much impact, if you defined your job as being not responsible for fire safety but for life safety, you would fight for narrower streets and maybe also buy some smaller trucks, right? But most of the cities I work in, we don't say buy a smaller truck. We work with the fire chief to make sure it fits. But I do want to say, though, that I think that there's a misunderstanding in most fire departments about what makes a safe society, because not many people are dying in house fires, and most of their truck calls are for car crashes.
I'm sort of curious about, it seems like more and more people are shopping online, and that has a really detrimental effect on small businesses. And small businesses are sort of what you were pointing out as being important to walkability. I just wondered if you can talk about that at all, if
Yeah.
that's something you've thought about.
So I don't have good news about that. Well, it's good news for me, but not for small businesses, which is that I work with retail experts. I work on developments that are trying to have successful retail, and we call in the professionals. They've made it very clear, and this has been the case for maybe 15 years, that retail is bifurcating into two types of retail. There's convenience and price retail, which is satisfied by Walmart and Amazon, and then there's experiential retail, which is the other shopping, where people do it because they actually want to have the experience. And what that means actually is we've lost the middle. We've lost the kind of Main Street, reasonably priced, or we're losing. You can see contradictions to this, but generally, nationally, as a trend, we're losing the middle of the affordably priced Main Street shop. And you can see why, because the small merchants can't compete with Amazon or with Walmart. What that means, though, is that the people who are shopping in stores are doing it for the experience to a certain degree. Then they demand, actually, a good experience. And that means that we have to make these main streets walkable, or they will fail to be either affordable or a good experience. But main streets are coming back. Unfortunately, it's only in those places where people want to walk.
Thanks for a great speech and for coming here. I really appreciated that. I have two simple questions, I hope. One is with regard to Burlington. You mentioned that. It's a highway. It's Highway 1. And as a cyclist, I try to choose other options, but sometimes I'll go down Burlington, and on the north side of the street, if you choose to be on the sidewalk, you'll be stopped by the police. You'll get a ticket. If you're on the south side of the street, on that sidewalk, it's fine. So it's
good to know.
A little bit of good to know. And I've been on that street. There's semi trucks that go by. They're driving very quickly, and they're kind of narrow lanes, so you're not really safe riding in that experience. Anyway, so that was kind of maybe some comments on that. And then the second one is, you mentioned Portland. I've started something called the Small House Society back about 15 years ago. You may have heard of it.
Nice.
And now the small house movement has kind of grown. I actually started it with Jay Schaefer and a couple other people here in Iowa City. So the movement kind of got started around 2002. But do you have any thoughts on the small house movement and how other cities like Portland can begin to have housing code that is more small house friendly, like accessory dwelling units?
Yeah, I'm particularly interested in small houses in the accessory dwelling unit category. A number of cities, you may be aware, and maybe you're doing it here, have passed laws. Actually, it makes particular sense in a college town, and before you grimace, the idea is that you put a small cottage either above your garage or in your backyard somewhere, and it allows you to double the density, in fact, of your home. Now, where it doesn't make sense, I imagine, is just upping the density of a lot that's already full of students. But the tradition of the granny flat in the backyard is that the principal homeowner is actually a homeowner, not 6 students sharing a house, and then they supervise the tenant. So actually, rather than having campus police making sure people aren't being too rowdy, each landlord is minding their tenant. But as I'm talking about it, I'm realizing probably not too many of the houses near campus are owner-occupied, so that might be an issue. But certainly, it's a great way to increase density and therefore walkability without fundamentally changing the way neighborhoods work. I meant to show Burlington because what I discovered pacing across Burlington today with my colleagues is that it's 5 lanes in 60 feet. Now, the state should accept the NACTO 10-foot lane suggestion. It'll take time. Anything with the state, you got to add a couple years. But there's no reason why that couldn't be a 10-foot center turn lane, 2 more 10-foot lanes for cars, 2 more 11-foot lanes for buses. They should be 10, but the state will insist on 11. Fine. And then one side of 8 feet that could be, for example, a Jersey barrier and a 2-way bike track, or what I had imagined, because I don't expect people to bike on that street, was parallel parking on one side, which would really slow traffic down. Now, I would leave it to others to decide whether that's a good bike corridor or not, and maybe it should be only a parallel parking corridor. But the key to so many improvements on these streets is going from the 12-foot lane, or in that case, the 12-point-something foot lane, to the 10-foot lane. And then you have room for something that's going to calm the traffic. And a big reason why people are speeding on Burlington is because it's the 70-mile-an-hour, 12-foot lanes, right? I'll take one more question, and then I'll meet you outside.
I was looking at the census numbers, and the bicycle commuters in Iowa City is somewhere between 4% and 5%.
That's good.
And that was my first question. How does that stack up?
Yeah.
Secondly, how do you think about bicycle trails as opposed to roads? And what's the relationship between investing in bike lanes and encouraging additional bicycle traffic?
So 4% is very high. I think it's not that unusual for student towns, for big colleges. But in typical American cities, many of them are below 1%. So that is very good. What you need for a bike network, as I say in my book, is not a piece of every road tied up neatly with a bow given to every bicyclist. A good bike network doesn't include every street. It just allows bicyclists to get safely to their destinations, and they will get there at some point in trails, at some point in buffered lanes, and some point in integrated lanes in the street, and some point in slow streets where they just share with everybody, and at some places you expect them to walk the bike on the sidewalk or on a pedestrian mall. That's the goal. The proper facility depends on where you're trying to put it. So on a highway, you wouldn't want an integrated lane, and that's where the bike trail that's hopefully at some distance from the road is the right solution. If a street is slow enough, then that nasty integrated bike lane that I showed with that poor girl in it actually can be an appropriate solution, particularly if there's not room for a buffered lane. And then ideally on a busy street, you want to have the lane that's protected. I should add that often when I recommend bike lanes in streets in cities, it's more to slow the cars down. Like the first motivation is just to notice there's 5 extra feet in this street. What can we do with 5 feet? Well, with 5 feet, you can lay in a bike lane, but you can't put in a buffered bike lane. So in some cases, the less advanced solution is what's available. But it's still better to have that lane than to have nothing.
So investment to move the
Oh yeah, so I talked about that. I mean, I really do believe, and other folks who have no vested interest, I believe, will tell you that the principal determinant of bicycling population is bicycle investment, period. That culture matters a little, topography matters a little, climate matters a little, but investment matters the most. And that's a good place to end. So thank you again, and I'll see you outside.